gotta kill people, you gotta rob, you gotta do what you gotta do to survive.
What is this?
Crazy criminal. Say crazy criminal.
Ya no somos los maras o las maras o los grupos delincuenciales o el país de los muertos, sino que ahora somos El Salvador.
The director brought up that a lot of folks will raise concerns from a human rights perspective and an abuse of human rights, that he's calm hearing that because he sees it day to day, the process they go through to maintain, as he sees it, proper punishment.
No mattresses, no sheets, no visitors. 80 prisoners crammed into cells built for 20. One toilet, a single barrel of drinking water, and contaminations spreading like wildfire. 23.5 hours locked inside each day. Mysterious deaths that no one investigates.
The only light you get is through this hole. They can be in here for 15 days, potentially.
This is CICOT, El Salvador's mega prison, where 40,000 gang members are paying the price for decades of violence. Is it inhumane? Maybe. Is it effective? Absolutely. In just 5 years, El Salvador transformed from the murder capital of the world to the Western Hemisphere's second safest country, safer than the United States. The cost? Basic human rights, due process, and thousands of potentially innocent people behind bars. But ask most Salvadorans, and they'll tell you, anything is better than living under gang rule. This is the brutal reality inside El Salvador's new prisons, and the sad reason behind it. Imagine living in a country where just going out for a walk could get you killed, where gangs controlled every street corner and violence was just a part of daily life. This was El Salvador just a few years ago. It was the murder capital of the world, with a murder rate 20 times higher than the United States. But today, it's the second safest country in the Western Hemisphere, right after Canada. Yes, you heard that right. It's even safer than the United States. And this transformation happened in just a few years. So what changed? The answer lies behind the walls of what might be the most controversial prison system ever created. Meet CICOT, the Center for the Confinement of Terrorism. Just getting there feels like entering a military zone. Even with official permission, you're stopped a mile out at the first checkpoint, then another checkpoint. As you approach the main gate, your phone signal disappears. Powerful jammers create a 2-kilometer dead zone around the facility to prevent inmates from communicating with the outside world.
He's gonna inspect bags now too.
Before you can enter, you go through what one reporter called airport security on steroids, multiple body scans, detailed inspections, and rigorous protocols. Even wedding rings are scrutinized. Nothing is left to chance.
So this is like airport security on steroids. Anything that we're carrying with us, okay, anything we're carrying with us has to go there, and then there's a body scan that continues on the other side.
Why? Because this isn't just any prison. It's a fortress designed to hold Latin America's most dangerous gang members, dubbed the worst of the worst. The facility is massive, equivalent to 7 football stadiums. 3 rings of security protect it. The outer wall stands 9 meters high, topped with 3 meters of electric fencing carrying 15,000 volts. Over 1,000 guards, police, and military personnel maintain constant watch. Inside, cells hold up to 80 prisoners each. But don't imagine that there's any comfort or even utilities for these guys. No TVs, no desks, no mattresses, just metal bunks with no bed sheets to cover themselves at night.
There's no mattresses, there's no sheets. You've got a toilet over here for them to go to the bathroom. You've got this basin here that they use to bathe themselves. And then you can see there's a barrel of water that they can drink from.
Yeah, a barrel of water for all these people. You can easily imagine the contamination that spreads here. And there's no doctors to help them in cases someone falls ill. 2 cement tubs for washing, 1 toilet for dozens of people, and 0 visitor privileges. The routine is brutal. 23.5 hours a day, locked in these crowded cells. That precious half hour of freedom, it's for religious services or exercise.
The director tells me the inmates, once they're inside one of these sectors, they never leave. Everything is done within.
For those who break the rules, there's solitary confinement, a 3 by 2 meter cell with only a tiny roof window for light, up to 15 days in complete isolation.
The only light you get is through this hole. They can be in here for 15 days, potentially.
And unless they're in this small hellhole, prisoners are watched from a close distance 24/7.
He says there's always somebody standing here in front of the cells, and then if you look up, there's another corridor with more security personnel.
The prison director makes no apologies for these conditions. As he puts it, comfort isn't meant to exist here.
The director brought up that a lot of folks will raise concerns from a human rights perspective and an abuse of human rights. That he's calm hearing that because he sees it day to day, the process they go through to maintain, as he sees it, proper punishment.
But to understand why El Salvador built such an extreme prison, we need to go back to the 1980s, when the country was torn apart by civil war. It started with Archbishop Oscar Romero writing to President Jimmy Carter, begging him to stop funding El Salvador's military regime. The regime's response? They assassinated Romero. At his funeral, where 250,000 people gathered to mourn, the National Guard opened fire on the crowd, killing 42 and injuring over 200. Months later, they murdered 4 American missionaries in broad daylight, leaving their bodies in the open as a message. The missionaries weren't just killed, they were subjected to fates worse than death by these monsters. They were taken as symbols of America and treated with shocking hatred. Their deaths came as mercy. After this, Jimmy Carter finally ended the military aid. Yep, until then, the US was funding El Salvador's military. So in 1981, a civilian resistance force was formed, the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, or the FMLN, and to fight the oppressive army, they ended up just as violent. They almost took over the country when Ronald Reagan was elected in the US, and you all know how Reagan wanted to fight the communist threat by funding far-right military groups in Latin and South America. Yeah, politics are often brutal and money-oriented, and they cost innocent lives. Reagan not only restarted the financial aid to the Salvadoran National Guard, but increased it to $10 million. $5 million went to rifles, ammo, grenades, and helicopters. The violence spiraled. Throughout the 1980s, El Salvador was ravaged by unspeakable brutality. Bodies piled up in the streets faster than they could be buried, and women were subjected to tragic things by violent men with a penchant for cruelty and control. SA was the only thing more frequent than murder. In 1989, the Soviet Union collapsed. This meant an end to the foreign financial support to the FMLN. However, it also meant Reagan had no reason to use the communist threat as an excuse to fund armies anymore. At this point, El Salvador was a wasteland still ravaged by violence and shocking levels of poverty. Thousands fled to the United States, especially Los Angeles. But these refugees, many of them traumatized teenagers, found themselves in a foreign land where they didn't fit in.
You gotta kill people, you gotta rob, you gotta do what you gotta do to survive.
You have to do those things.
Yeah, you gotta do that.
And if you didn't do those things, you wouldn't.
You wanna be a gangbanger.
That's when they formed the gangs that would later terrorize their homeland, MS-13 and Barrio 18. MS-13 stands for Mara Salvatrucha. Mara means gang, Salva is for El Salvador, and Trucha means street smart. The 13th? That's just M's position in the alphabet. But these weren't your typical street gangs. They became known for extreme brutality. As one FBI agent put it, they opted for machetes, not guns, as they did not want to give anyone a quick death. By 2012, MS-13 became the first street gang designated as a transnational criminal organization by the US Treasury, putting them in the same category as the Mexican Zetas and Japanese Yakuza. The gang's growth was fueled by a brutal recruitment strategy, targeting society's most vulnerable members. They specifically sought out poor, isolated teenagers, often from broken homes or with histories of petty crime and drug addiction. Instead of getting the support they needed to overcome their rough upbringing, these kids found themselves pulled into a cycle of escalating violence. MS-13's influence spread like wildfire across the United States. According to the FBI, the gang established operations in 46 states. Their reputation for extreme violence made them stand out even in areas already plagued by gang activity. They scared even the most hardened local criminals. MS-13 were creating a culture of terror that would later be exported back to El Salvador. What made MS-13 particularly dangerous was how they turned their recruits into desensitized monsters. New members were forced to commit increasingly violent acts to prove their loyalty. The gang's motto became Mata, Viola, Controla, kill, rape, control. They transformed troubled teens into remorseless killers, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of violence that crossed borders and generations. In 1996, the US started deporting gang members back to El Salvador, and that's when things got really bad. By 2015, El Salvador had become the murder capital of the world. The statistics were staggering. 1 in every 5,000 women lost their lives. The femicide rate was the highest globally. SA was an everyday affair too, but few cases were reported because victims feared gang retaliation. Imagine that, to be destroyed in this way by a monster, but risk getting unalived if you say something about it. The gangs didn't just control the streets, they controlled the prisons too. Different facilities had to be designated for different gangs to prevent them from killing each other.
We're at the Central Criminal Courts for San Salvador. That's these buildings, and then over there behind us there's the morgue. And that's really the two ways out for an awful lot of gang members. They're either brought here and then go on to jail, or they're brought here dead.
Some gang members were so famously brutal that Mexican cartels like Sinaloa, Los Zetas, and CJNG recruited them. For ordinary citizens, especially women and children, life was a nightmare. Parents couldn't let their kids play outside. Everyone lived in constant fear. Businesses had to pay protection money just to stay open. There was no justice and no sense of safety anywhere in El Salvador. Enter Nayib Bukele. In 2019, everything changed when Nayib Bukele became president. At just 37 years old, this former advertising executive promised something radical: a total war on gangs. He was the first president from a different party, Nuevas Ideas or New Ideas, to take office in a long time. And unlike his last three predecessors, who had all been jailed for working with gangs, Bukele promised to destroy them. But in March 2022, the gangs decided to show who really controlled El Salvador. In just 3 days, they killed 87 people, almost at random. It was meant to be a show of force. Instead, it became their biggest mistake. Bukele's response was swift and unprecedented. He declared a state of emergency that continues to this day. Constitutional rights were suspended. Police could arrest anyone suspected of gang ties without explaining why. Freedom of assembly and privacy of communications were eliminated.
Human rights groups are dismayed, as are relatives, as more than 65,000 people have been arrested over the past year.
Across the country, more than 70,000 people have already been taken into custody, proudly trumpeting a huge decline in the country's murder rate.
The results were staggering. In just 2 years, authorities arrested more than 80,000 people, over 10% of El Salvador's adult male population. The murder rate plummeted from 103 per 100,000 in 2015 to just 2.4 per 100,000 in 2024.
But right now, La Campanera feels downright safe, in large part due to a big police presence.
Ya no somos los maras o las maras o los grupos delincuenciales o el país de los muertos, sino que ahora somos El Salvador.
The streets feel safe. Children and their mothers can smile again, but no one wants to think of the horrors happening inside the prisons that now hold the MS-13 members. This brings us back to CCOT, Bukele's solution to housing all these prisoners. When new inmates arrive, they're stripped to their underwear, shackled, and forced to run a gauntlet of armed guards, all filmed by government cameras to show the world that El Salvador means business. The prison is divided into 8 sectors, each containing dozens of large cells. Once assigned to a sector, inmates never leave. Perhaps the most shocking is the prison's approach to rival gangs. MS-13 and Barrio 18 members, who once killed each other on sight, are now forced to share cells. The armory is equipped with cutting-edge assault rifles, and 250 CCTV cameras monitor every movement. The goal is complete control. Even the inmates' tattoos, once proud symbols of their gang affiliations, have become marks of shame. Some former gang members who've escaped to other countries are now paying to have their facial tattoos removed, hoping to avoid deportation back to El Salvador. This dramatic transformation hasn't come without cost. Critics point out that innocent people get caught in the dragnet. Some detainees wait years for their first hearing. Others die in custody under mysterious circumstances. Human rights organizations have documented at least 215 deaths in custody. Some inmates die from untreated illnesses. In cells packed with 100 people, disease spreads fast. When inmates die, authorities often don't report what happened. Take Carla Michelle Mejia. Locked up without a release date, her father couldn't even find out where she was being held.
Ella es mi hija, Carla Michelle Mejía, que está detenida desde hace 19 meses a causa del régimen. Y es allí donde me toca que luchar para demostrar la inocencia de mi hija. Lo que les digo es que siempre el régimen ha servido para que la gente se aproveche de la gente más vulnerable.
When he finally located her, he wasn't allowed to visit. His pleas to various institutions were ignored.
Usted va a los juzgados, no pueden dar información si no va a su abogado. ¿Va a la Procuraduría de Derechos Humanos? No es competencia de la Procuraduría dar esa información.
The growing pressure on police officers to arrest gang members every day led to arbitrary arrests and mistakes.
Antes le teníamos a las pandillas, pero ahora le tememos a la autoridad y eso no tendría que ser. A la autoridad se le tiene que tener respeto, no miedo.
The government admits that innocent people get caught up in the crackdown. They've released over 7,000 wrongfully arrested individuals. Officials call it collateral damage in their war on gangs. But here's the thing. Most Salvadorans support Bukele's methods. His approval rating stands at 92%. That's unheard of for any president. Why? Because for the first time in generations, people feel safe. Kids play in parks that were once gang territories. Women walk the streets without fear. Businesses operate without paying protection money. Football matches are being organized in neighborhoods where they were once impossible. As one supporter put it,
Alguna gente dice que eso es un exceso. Yo lo que creo que era exceso era la cantidad de muertos. Para mí era un exceso la cantidad de niñas violadas en El Salvador todos los días. Para mí era un exceso todos los negocios que tenían que pagar extorsión.
the transformation has been so dramatic that other countries are taking notice. Ecuador has already built its own version of CICOT. Their president, Daniel Noboa, proudly declared,
Entonces, para todos los Bukele lovers, una cárcel igualita.
Many see El Salvador as proof that organized crime can be defeated, but this success raises some uncomfortable questions. Can brutal methods be justified if they save lives? Should basic human rights be suspended to ensure public safety? What happens to a society when people start fearing the authorities instead of criminals? And perhaps most importantly, what happens when the state of emergency ends? Will the gangs come roaring back? Or has El Salvador truly changed forever?
Creo que ya está generando mucha esperanza. Cualquier estado tiene capacidad de derrotar al crimen organizado, que es el principal enemigo de millones de latinoamericanos.
El Salvador's story shows us that sometimes the line between justice and brutality isn't as clear as we'd like to think. While President Bukele's methods are controversial, they've transformed one of the world's most dangerous countries into one of its safest. The price of this safety? A prison system that pushes the boundaries of human rights, thousands of potentially innocent people behind bars, and a population that lives under constant surveillance. But for many Salvadorans, it's a price worth paying to never again be known as the murder capital of the world. What do you think about El Salvador's approach? Is this the future of fighting organized crime, or a dangerous precedent that gives too much power to the state? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this. Thanks for watching.